Ruby Warrington, welcome to the Mom Curious podcast. I am still vibing, literally vibing, vibrations of happiness and joy and utter celebration of your book launch last night.
Well, thank you.
Oh my gosh, it was so fun. It was a packed house of women, some who have kids and some who don't, all who absolutely love you and your work. Your work includes Sober Curious and what is it? It's Mystical, no.
Material Girl.
Mystical World. Pardon me. The Numinous. Where I know the Numinous because my friend Alexandra used to write for them, the Holy Fuck podcast. I mean, the Holy Fuck column, and now it's a podcast. You're a book doula. You're an amazing woman. You have a podcast of your own. Your new book is Women Without Kids. I know a woman without kids, and she's sitting right there. She's my favorite woman.
Fuck yeah, bro.
Yes.
I'm so happy to have you on.
It's a manifesto. It's a rally cry for the unsung sisterhood.
The unsung sisterhood of women without kids. Yes. And I felt that vibe in the room last night.
Yeah.
It's the first in-person event that I've hosted since the pandemic. And it was incredible just to be reminded of what happens when a group of people come together who are on the same vibe, who are just here for it. I really felt it in the room.
Yeah.
I didn't sleep last night. I texted Alexandra this morning. I was like, didn't sleep last night in the good way. You know what I mean?
I do. Because it was a really palpable energy.
Really was. And I felt I felt if we'd have stayed for another hour, we could have and had a longer discussion with the Q&A. I think it could have just built and built and built. I could really feel that vibe. And so what I really hope with this book, I've been saying this from the beginning, I want people to read this in community. I want people to read this book with their mum friends, with their non-mum friends, with their partners, with their mothers, with their siblings, with their book groups. You know, I just think it's such a conversation starter.
Yes.
And Rachel, who co-hosted last night, touched on that as well. She's like, this book is a conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah.
So I feel like, I feel really grateful and overwhelmed at times because it's a big conversation. But here I am. I'm the person that apparently is here to steward that into the public consciousness. So
as you have so many things. I mean,
Right.
You did it with astrology, you did it with sobriety, and here we are talking about chosen non-motherhood. It's such an interesting thing. Like you say in the book that there's this idea that the epitome of womanhood is motherhood, which is such bullshit. But even in relation to even the language around saying non-motherhood or not parenting or without kids, it's
right.
I feel so frustrated about that.
I'm frustrated with the languaging too. There isn't any other way to say it. And what I've landed on is this: there is something that is not here. If I don't have a child, I don't have a child. And I guess it'll be interesting to see what kind of conversations come out of even this small part of the discussion. What do we have when we don't have children? What do we have in our lives when that space is not filled by not only the physical human beings, but also all of the caregiving and all of the attention and energy and other resources that go into being a mother, you know? So what do we make space for? And Rachel, again, was sort of touching on that. What are the things that you have in your life as a result that are a direct result of you not having children? And it's things like, time, space, energy.
3 books.
Abundance, 3 books.
2 podcasts.
2 podcasts.
Lots of friends.
Lots of friends.
Full of real.
Seriously.
Love.
It's funny. I was in New York for 10 years, the whole time during COVID. And I sort of felt like the city had really emptied out. I just had this vibe that people have just left and moved on. And this is a city that kind of cycles through people, I think. You know, people come, they go, they either get burnt out, they move on.
COVID was terrible.
And then COVID was harsh. But last night I was just reminded of wow, there's so many amazing people in this city. And over 10 years of, again, stewarding these different projects, movements here, I just was reminded of what an amazing community there is here, of such forward thinking and progressive individuals. So that was really great to see last night.
Yeah, it was really special for me to witness also, like the family that you created, like even the people who raised their hands and, you know, they shared so openly, so vulnerably about their worries, about fear of missing out. You know, you talk about having an absolute no, and you've always known that you didn't want children, but there are people who are on the sort of, you know, you call it a spectrum, the motherhood spectrum. Maybe you can go into that a little bit. And I think that the listener here is probably one of those people, because they probably wouldn't click on Mom Curious and the various different ways of being a mother or not that exist. But if you can go into what the motherhood spectrum is and your own grappling with that, I really.
So I guess I'll begin with a bit about my personal story. So I am what I term an affirmative no about motherhood. Like I've just always known, but just on a very intuitive, felt level, that I would not be a mother. It wasn't even that I was rejecting, like actively saying, oh, I definitely don't want to do that. It just wasn't even it's never even been on the table for me personally. Lots of other people put it on my table and asked me, why are you not doing this thing? Why do you not want to be a mother? Are you sure you won't change your mind? Have you really thought about it? I mean, that's the question. Have you really thought about this? Yeah, it's kind of like the biggest decision a person can make with their life. It's something I've thought about.
The therapist in your book is like pathologizing that experience. Like,
I think
not getting off of it really, really bothered me.
I think a lot of people experience that. Just this assumption, because the conditioning, whether it's true or not, the conditioning is there, that motherhood is synonymous with womanhood, that no woman is complete until she becomes a mother. This is very real conditioning. It still exists. And I think anybody who is childless by choice or even childless by circumstance, and I'll get into that terminology in a bit, will have kind of come up against that. But I think it's, the fact that there is this sort of assumption that you will change your mind, that you have not really considered or thought this through properly, that you will ultimately regret it, and that there will always be something missing if you don't become a mother, is so, so prevalent. So as much as I had confidently just gone about living my life doing all the other things that did feel like a yes for me, things that I did have more time, energy, and other resources to invest in because I was not a mother, other people had a lot of strong opinions about it. So I questioned it deeply throughout my 20s and 30s. Why don't I want to do this? Is there something wrong with me? What's missing?
No, there's nothing.
And so, I wanted to write the book to speak to that process, and that can apply to someone who's more of an affirmative no, or someone who's on the fence and more ambivalent about their feelings around motherhood. Like, is this something sometimes I think I do, but sometimes I think I don't. And when I weigh up all of the different factors that are going to play into how this impacts my life, then maybe it's not something I can do, let alone want to do. So the people I was describing there who are, okay, so back to the motherhood spectrum, I kind of set the book up. Chapter 1 talks about this. I think we've had a very binary idea of motherhood. You're either an affirmative yes, and you are doing the right thing. You will be fulfilled. You will find happiness. Nothing will be missing. All the boxes will be checked. Or you're a no, and you are destined to be sad, lonely, frustrated, unfulfilled, and probably die alone.
And unhappy.
It just seems that there's been this very kind of binary attitude. But actually what I present, and this is something I kind of, a positioning I used with Sober Curious as well, is that between those two extremes, actually, there is so many shades of gray. And there is a spectrum when it comes to both our desire and our aptitude for the vocation of parenthood, where we orient on that spectrum, of course, is going to be influenced by our personality, our family of origin, the culture and the society that we grew up in, our economic situation, our relationship status, our ambitions, our talents, our hopes and dreams for our lives, all of these things, our health, our mental health, our physical ability, our gender expression, all of these things are going to impact whether or not we want to become a parent or are able to become a parent.
Right.
We've had this binary has kind of really boiled human beings down to our biological reproductive capacity. It says if you have the biological capacity to birth a child, then that is what you are here to do. When obviously, just obviously, all of these other factors are going to play an equal, if not bigger role in our feelings about becoming a parent, and even our feelings about being a parent once we've had children.
Right. I mean, I read it as a parent of two, and I loved every single word. I loved how you dug deep into the epigenetics I talk so at length about breaking family cycles. You know what a great way to break family cycles is? Not to have kids.
Right.
That's an option. And I think that the book really outlines how important the mother experience actually really is.
Yes.
That it's to be considered, that there are enough people in the world, even with the rapid decline. Is this really happening?
I mean, that's somewhere else we can go. I want to touch on this idea that something is ending with us when we don't have children.
Yeah.
That sometimes is presented as very sad. And it can feel sort of, oh, this is it. This ends with me. But on the other side, what if this ends with me? This ends with me. This is a consideration that our mothers, their mothers, and certainly their mothers never even had the option to consider. Do I want to continue another cycle of whatever family drama, dysfunction I find myself embroiled in? It's only from the 1960s onwards that a more mainstream conversation has been happening. And it's still by no means an option for, I would say, a majority of women in the world. It's still something that we are fighting for women to have, the actual space to consider and make a considered decision about our procreative potential, what that's going to mean for us on a mental, physical, emotional, and a spiritual level. And that's just huge. And I don't think it can be stated enough, how important it is for women to be able to enter into motherhood with full agency and a full understanding of all of the potential consequences and impacts on her life and her children's lives.
And their children's
as a
lives.
Result. Exactly. It's a huge.
And the planet itself.
And the planet itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you said in the book that about 80% of people would consider their family of origin to be dysfunctional.
Yes.
What? That's a very big number.
It is. And it's interesting, as a journalist of 25 years experience, if you search around for long enough, you can find statistics that will pretty much back up any argument you want to make. But the statistics around family dysfunction are, pretty clear. The majority of people, and I was actually having this conversation with Alexandra over dinner after the event last night. We were just questioning, this idea, this kind of Brady Bunch kind of, ideal of this idealized happy family who all sort of get along and maybe they have a few disagreements, but they all just love each other really. Does that actually exist? Because I don't really know. I haven't really seen that many examples of this kind of sentimentalized kind of happy family scenario. I think that the majority of people, this is probably to do with the fact that we have more language now and more understanding of what family dysfunction even is. I think so much of what we view and call family dysfunction now, 100 years ago, was normal. Just normal, Yeah. It wouldn't even have been seen as dysfunctional. So the fact that people have the tools, the access, the language to assess, is this something I want to replicate by bringing another human being into the world and entering into another cycle of everything I've inherited, my emotional inheritance from my family of origin. It's a huge piece of this conversation, and it's absolutely, I think, impacting people's ultimate decisions. Even Rachel last night was talking about how her decision not to have a child is very much linked to the specific flavor kind of her family trauma, having been a caregiver for a mother with disabilities from a very young age, she's mothered out. She's like, I did my mothering when I was a kid. And this is something I've heard from a lot of women without kids, actually, which again is not really spoken of. But this idea that many of us, and particularly in a society where family structures are so fragile, you know, where there is often a lot of abuse of power, where the freedom and agency dynamic among, you know, parents is often very unequal. There's a lot of kids who are parentified at a very early age, whether it means caring for emotionally immature parents, physically, handicapped, but also just kind of materially challenged, let's say, parents, you know, parents who are struggling to make ends meet and relying on their kids, or whether they're caring for younger siblings. A lot of non-mothers, a lot of women I've met who are questioning whether they want to become mothers. Yeah, they can identify. I kind of feel like I just want to look after myself now. I'm done with looking after everybody else, you know? Yeah. And that's an absolutely valid option. That's not a selfish option.
No, it's actually the opposite of selfish, because we need happy people.
Yeah, we really need happy people.
Like, we need happy people writing books. We need happy people as cashiers. We need happy people walking down the street for ourselves, for our children, happy people are people who aren't eating too much or burning this or drinking too much or burning this earth, down.
Right.
Happy people are the ones who are there every day enjoying their lives without the suffering of others.
Happy people are also the people who can step up to help love and bring up and be a big participant in your children's lives.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what Laura does. Absolutely.
So like if I don't have kids, and I believe Caitlin touched on this when she was here, and if I don't have kids, it opens me up to show up for you then when you need it in a different way that I might not be able to do if I had kids.
Yeah.
So it really is about that sangha. It's about community,
society at large. I think something that I loved in the writing, Ruby, is that you get very specific about your own personal story, which I so appreciate. This whole podcast is about, each particular person's firsthand account, because I really believe that that's how we connect. That's how we grow as a collective. And what you also did was, because you have this journalistic view, you allowed you allowed us to sort of pull back the lens and say, okay, well, I've always known that I didn't want children. What about those who are still grappling? What about those with infertility issues? What about those? What is going on in society at large that are making women these days not want to have kids,
or unable to have kids, for whatever reason? So this might be a good point to touch on the childless by circumstance. So there are statistics that show that of all the people who don't have children, about 10% are childless by choice. This is an affirmative no to motherhood. This is something I'm choosing for myself very kind of confidently and clearly. Then you have about 10% who've been impacted by fertility issues. And then the remaining 80% are what are called childless by circumstance, would potentially have become parents had things just kind of worked out differently, the kind of circumstances that are impacting people's procreative outcomes in this way, economic situation, wanting to establish themselves in their career before embarking on parenthood. And increasingly, we're seeing women chided for that. You really should be having children in your 20s, and then thinking about your career. Okay, but how am I supposed to support myself in my 20s? And where am I supposed to be finding someone in my 20s on these fucking dating apps where it's all about transactional sex? Like, sorry.
And who are we having this conversation? But who are we having this conversation with, right?
Right.
You talk about how women without kids are othered. Who is othering these women, and why? Why?
Right.
On the whole, my guess, can I just say, as being a major recipient of this, so just for some context, me and my husband have been together since we're 18 years old. So like everyone is absolutely like, why don't you have children? You know? And I'm like, if I had focused on having children in my 20s, we wouldn't be sitting in my studio recording this podcast right now in my 30s. You know, it was like, that was the sacrifice. We wanted to work. We worked together. We built this business together. And that was something we much preferred to do.
And it was probably more suited to who you are as individuals for all of the kinds of reasons that I listed earlier.
Absolutely. But I was also always a pretty hard no. In like from a very young age, instinctually just knew it was like not a thing that I needed to do or wasn't going to do is a better way to put it. But yeah, no, I'm noticing a major increase in getting shit for it. And I'm tired
The
of
older
it.
you get, the closer to 40 you
How
get.
old are
Yes,
you?
because I'm 35 and people are concerned.
This is the age because we have this kind of, I don't know, quote unquote scientific kind of view that past age 35, it gets a lot harder.
Well, that's a
for a woman to
geriatric
conceive. It becomes
pregnancy.
a geriatric pregnancy. So you've got 5 years of this.
Yes.
By the time you turn 40, everyone will just kind of leave you alone. They'll fuck off and be like, oh, she didn't get the memo. Whatever.
Beautiful.
You do you, babe.
Good. Only 5 more years to go. I got it. I could do 5 more.
You go into an idea of like pro-natalism. Is that what it's called?
That is the term.
Okay. Would you let us know what that is? Because I think these people who are bullying you guys.
Yes.
Bullying.
It's bullying. It's harassment.
It's harassment. It's a big problem.
It really
Because
They
they're basically
are-
saying this is what you should be doing with your body.
And you're less than because you are not doing it is implied all the time.
Yes.
Or you will be lacking and sad and you will not be able to pick up the
And
pieces.
also,
it will be too late.
If you're telling me you don't want to have children, you don't know your own mind.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So pronatalism, this is a function of pronatalism. Pronatalism is one of the cornerstones of patriarchy. It's an ideology. The ideology of pronatalism says that parents are more valid than non-parents.
So, I had this in the first season of Mom Curious. My best friend, Genevieve Angelson, a prolific artist and actress, sat down and we had a lovely conversation. And all of a sudden, in the middle of it, she had a real emotional reaction to feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like my life is as worthy as yours because you have children. And I looked her straight in the eye and I was like, this is crazy. This is brainwashing.
It is brainwashing, yeah. And it's embedded in our psyches and our culture to the extent that people don't realize, they don't know they're doing it. It's just like this assumption. But the way that we move beyond these conditioned beliefs is we bring them out into the open, we look at them, we talk about them, we're like, where did that come from? Who's benefiting from this? Very importantly, who is benefiting from this?
So who is? Tell me.
Okay, so we touched on the scaremongering around population collapse.
Yep.
So on the one, it's very interesting. On the one hand, we have people who are concerned about the environment and the future of the planet, saying we have too many people. The planet and the planetary systems just simply cannot support the level of kind of population growth that's occurring. And on the other hand, we have people saying we're headed for a crisis. We are not having enough new people are not being born to support the aging population. Plus, people are now living too long, having spent, centuries investing so much money, time, energy, and human ingenuity into expanding and extending human lifespans. Now people are living too long. And so we need people to get with the procreative program and make sure we have enough, essentially tax-paying workers coming into the economy to support our aging populations.
This is pronatalism.
So this is pronatalism. And so when we have things occurring such as the overturning of Roe v. Wade, this is a pronatalist tactic to ensure that we're having more babies born to feed human labor, cheap human labor, into the economy as it currently exists. So when people talk about population collapse, it's the Elon Musks of the world. They're talking about the collapse of an economic system, which is dependent not only on a constant source of fresh human labor power at the lowest cost to the captains of industry. And the more people there are, the less power people have in terms of their value and their value in the labor force, right? But it also depends on women's unpaid child-rearing labor. This is something that feminists in the 70s were talking about. It was central to the message of the women's liberation movement, but it sort of got lost a little over the past few decades. And I think that this conversation about women without kids is revitalizing or putting the attention back on this simple fact. And I think the timing is very interesting. I started writing the proposal during the COVID pandemic. I'd already had the idea in 2019, but I'm writing the proposal as there are so many headlines about the COVID childcare crisis and how, my goodness, once schools and childcare and support systems are stripped away, we've reverted to the 1950s when it comes to gender roles in the home, which just shows how little real change or reform has been done in thinking about how families are supported, what families need, who does what in families, who gets remunerated what for performing the labor of child rearing. And so I think that conversation was really stirred up by the COVID situation and is absolutely a big part of. So when we're thinking about how are we going to support our older population, focusing on, well, we need more people to ensure that there are enough young people to, and like, quote unquote, care for, no, to pay taxes into a system so we can keep paying out the same pittance of a social security that elder people receive. But focusing on that requires us to go back to sort of very regressive, very oppressive, pre-feminist ideas about what women's place is and what women's role is in society. You know, it places women very firmly back in this role of, as Rianne Eisler, who's an amazing social scientist on sort of gender issues, talks about as being the technologies of reproduction, ultimately. When what we actually should be focusing on is, well, how do we better organize our economic system and our societies to support people from birth to death? This is something I kind of touched on last night. You know, we're being asked to, I think, revalue the entirety of a human life. What does it mean to bring a human life into the world? And how do we value that life from birth to death, not from birth to retirement, at which point people just they have no economic value. And so they are just written out of the story about what it even means to be a human, which is just so sad, so depressing. And it's at the heart of the fear mongering, which is still the one that niggles at me. Who will care for me when I'm old?
Well, listen, I have a neighbor who was an amazing mother. I've seen her with my children, and I've seen her with her 4 children. You know who takes care of her? An aide.
Right.
Come
Is
on.
it paid for by her children?
Probably not. And I heard you say that last night also. And I wanted to be like, babe, you gotta meet my neighbor.
I do want to meet your neighbor.
And also like my grandmother. I mean, my mother was very, 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 very good to my grandmother until the day she died. But really, who's there day in, day out? You know?
Yes, exactly.
And I don't know exactly who's paying for it, but I don't think her children are paying for it. I think she had money.
And this is the other thing. Like, I am able to actively save for my retirement because I don't have children. So I fully intend to be able to support myself. I'm making plans now in my 40s to be able to support myself in my 80s. I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that if I was channeling my resources, not just my financial resources, but my intellectual resources, my time, my energy into motherhood.
Yeah.
So we have a whole generation of women, thanks to the women's liberation movement, who have been generations of women who have been given the opportunities to create financial stability for ourselves. Our old age is going to look very different from the boomers who are aging out of the workforce now. Those boomer women didn't have any option to create financial stability for themselves. And so they need us, their daughters sometimes, to assist them. Women who have been able to prioritize our own financial stability and put our careers first and invest in our careers and invest in ourselves will be in a very different place financially when we age out of our working years, you know?
You did mention mother in terms of taking care of an elderly mother, and I know that you have an elderly mother that you're caring for now. Last night you said that aside from realizing that you're really happy you don't have kids because you're really an introvert. I'm an extrovert. So now I felt very validated in that. I was like, wow, I love people.
I need people around me all the time. I'm like, that's just would drive me completely insane.
But also you said that you have really found a new bond with your mother. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yes. I mean, it's sort of numinous, ineffable in its nature as these kind of things are. But I shared last night that I gave my mother the first draft of the manuscript to read. There's a lot of her story. It was necessary to tell her story, to give my story context. I needed partly for myself, just in the writing, to when I was really digging into the roots of like, why do I not want to be a mother? I had identified quite early on in my research process, and probably, in my own life on a subconscious level, that my feelings about being mothered and my experience of being mothered could not help but influence how I felt about becoming a mother, And I'd already had some conversations over the past few years with my mom about just the mothers in my lineage, and had realized how much pain and suffering had been experienced by the mothers in my lineage. People being abandoned, people experiencing mental illness, being institutionalized, having their children taken away from them. I mean, just so much trauma,
I thought about this around being institutionalized and having children taken away from you. We would not be able to have this conversation and be safe in those generations.
Right.
This conversation alone, my admission that, wow, yeah, some people really shouldn't have kids. Like, I'll tell you straight up, it's not for everyone.
Right.
It's not easy.
Right.
That, even admitting it's not easy.
Right.
Would land me into an institution in some generation.
Potentially. Or people who experience postpartum depression when there was no name for that, who were just medicalized. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was on Valium for most of her life and was completely checked out. I had no relationship with her. She was like a ghost in the family almost.
A living ghost.
And when I think about her, like, that was just kind of who she was. But I've obviously been reflecting a ton on like what I inherited from her, or how my experience of motherhood might have kind of in some way been akin to hers because of our genetic and emotional inheritance,
Yeah.
So anyway, I already had an inkling that mothers in my family had a hard time, but I wanted to put this into the manuscript just to kind of help make sense and give context for my story, I suppose. So I shared it with my mother, and she was very hurt, very upset. There were some very challenging conversations that we needed to have. One thing I realized as well is that there's no such thing as the absolute truth when it comes to our relationship with other human beings. Everybody has their very distinct version of events and the story that they have essentially created about what happened to make sense of it for them. And I realized that my story about my childhood is very different from my parents' story about my childhood. And they separated when I was 1. Yeah. So both my parents have a very different story about what happened as well.
And siblings too. You know, like you look at siblings, like your brother has a child, right?
Yes.
You look at siblings, they have a totally different outlook on life. They have the same, like, essentially genetic pool, the same household. They were probably growing up in the same city or town or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And yes, completely different experiences, different truths. So excavating what everybody felt comfortable with as our shared truth was harrowing. I will use the word harrowing. It was very, very painful. And the conversations that I've had, particularly with my mother as a result, have engendered a kind of a closeness that I never felt with her before. You know, never. I never thought I would be able to have a relationship with my mother where I felt really seen and accepted by her. For all sorts of reasons. But she's just seen and accepted parts of me that, I didn't even realize needed to have that acknowledgement from her. And as I shared last night, it's kind of bittersweet because I'll say it this way and then I'll kind of explain why I'm saying it this way. But it's bittersweet in a way because I do wonder if this had all happened 10, 15 years ago, would I have had or started to have a relationship with my mother that I did feel I would love to replicate this with another human being. You know, would it have altered where I fall on the motherhood spectrum? You know, ultimately, I am absolutely confident that being a non-mother is the absolute right path for me and for my gifts. And it has enabled me to really focus on who I am, what I have to give the world that's not a child. And I'm so grateful that to have had that opportunity and to have been born and come of age at a time when that's been supported by the culture that I've been raised in as well. Again, definitely not the case for all women on the planet at this juncture in our human story. Still not true for most women. But yeah, it's been incredible to have that healing happen with my mother as a result of writing this book. And the writer and the artist in me knows that if I've experienced that, other people will experience that through engaging with this work.
I agree.
You know?
You have a beautiful questionnaire in the book that really moved me as a mother. And I think it's worth taking a look at no matter where you fall on the motherhood spectrum. I had this experience when I had my son, not actually right after I had my son, but watching my mother love my son in the way that I wished she could have, and she really couldn't at the time. Let me just tell you that. If she could, she would.
Yeah.
Is so healing for me. And that sort of like metaphor of the book and the baby just remind me that creation in and of itself, that creating oneself, understanding oneself, accepting yourself as you did, Ruby, really allows us to have that intimacy with everybody, but more than ever with our primary relationships that'll be primary for until the day we die, until the day we die.
Absolutely. Until the day we die, long after they are gone. And I have to give a shout out to my mother. She started having therapy when I was about 12. She used to attend and then started to lead conscious parenting groups. So she really has done so much of her own work. And I'm so grateful, as a result of that, she's been able to meet me in this moment. And I also acknowledge that for some people that won't necessarily be possible. You have the person you're doing your healing with on some level has to be able to meet you, I think. And I'm so grateful that my mother has been able to do that, to bring us to this place. That said, an individual can come to so much understanding, acceptance, healing on their own just by kind of stating what needs to be stated, perhaps creating a boundary that needs to be created that hasn't been able to be constructed before. There are all kinds of ways to get really deep healing around this issue without the active engagement of a willing parent.
Well, you mentioned Maureen Selenet, who
yes, I saw you called her out her quotes on Insta.
Yeah, she was my coach.
That's amazing.
Family constellation. And I love the scene you laid out in the book. Maybe you want to go into it, because that's actually a great example of you dealt with your mother, your grandmother, your lineage without them ever being in the room.
Exactly. So family constellations is a form of therapy that, again, is super numinous. It's intangible in a way. And it's designed to help us kind of put the puzzle pieces of our lineage together and to organize people and situations as they are supposed to be. It's hard to describe, but I experienced Maureen's work in about 2014, a couple of years after I'd moved to New York, and had an incredible experience in a session where I experienced being my mother's mother. In a way, I kind of was able to embody my maternal grandmother, who passed away when my mum was 18. So I never knew her. And to feel in my body how much my mother had lost through losing her mother, and just get a kind of an understanding on a completely non-intellectual, emotional level of what she was therefore unable to give me because she had not received it from her mother. And there was so much pain in that. And it's taken a long time to really accept that. But that's been part of our healing story. And she wasn't present in that session.
It's like drama therapy.
Kinda. But
just to paint
that
the
can be a
picture
bit
for the
intimidating for someone who's a real introvert, and like the idea of improv from drama therapy is just like, hell no.
But you went. Why'd you go?
I did because I'm also brave and curious, and
check.
I wanted to check it out. It was when I was first establishing my platform, The Numinous, and I was a blog that I was running that was all about kind of mystical healing techniques, I suppose. And this sounded really interesting. But there's no improv. Like, you're kind of given lines to speak by the practitioner and told where to stand and what to do. It's very directed.
Yeah.
You're not having to lead it or guide it in any way. So it actually felt really safe. Maureen's such an amazing facilitator and holds the space really securely. And so, yeah. But do you want to add something about how it works?
It was founded by Bert Hellinger. He did some work in the Zulu tribes of Africa, and what they would do was, in order to reconcile these family constellations, these family lines, they would have these sort of meetings, and people would play at the characters in another person's life. The way you write about it in the book is so beautiful. We only have 5 minutes.
What? That went so fast.
No, I'm checking my notes. I feel so bummed about that. Well, you know what? We did a lot of stuff here.
We did. I was reflecting on what we communicated about, and okay.
Wait, you're reflecting.
No, I was just reflecting. I was like, we covered pro-natalism, population collapse, intergenerational healing. I think we've been doing pretty good.
What about the female body having sex because it feels good?
Yes.
We didn't cover
Thank
that,
you.
but we
Hardly
said
anyone
it.
has
There you
asked
go.
me about this. So there's a chapter in the book called Sexual Evolution. This was the hardest chapter to write. I was editing it until the very last minute, because it's still it's so unspoken in a way. But part of pronatalism and patriarchy dictates that women's or female sexuality is primarily and almost exclusively for reproductive purposes. The idea that female-bodied people can have a sexuality that is purely for pleasure and self-gratification is still absolutely shockingly taboo. And I think that women without kids, without having to say a word, are the walking, talking embodiment of this fact.
Which is why you get bullied, guys.
Which is one reason we get bullied. And I think one reason there's so much stigma. I was speaking to Alexandra about this. She's like, yeah. She's like, as the single childless one, I used to feel so slutty. And I'm like, I could relate to it. I'm like, yeah, kind of slutty, like dirty almost.
That's not yours, guys. That's
oh
not
my
yours.
God. That's so there.
Well,
throw it out.
Do you know
Not
what I
yours,
get?
it's theirs.
I get often, because we have been together for so long, and people are confused. Are you swingers? There's an implication that we swing.
And that's why you don't have
And
children?
that's why we don't have kids, because we're like part of the lifestyle, and like it's like kind of implied that, and it's happened from people I know very, very well, that I'm like, where the fuck would I have the time for that? To like people, that it's like, where do you get off even bringing this up with me?
How is that any of your
So it's
business?
interesting. It's like they'll find a way. Where there's a will, there's a way to like shame and like, slut shame in some way. Like, it's remarkable. It really
For
is.
any female woman identifying individual who is engaging with their sexuality for non-reproductive purposes, there is this shame that's projected at us. And I think this applies to queer sexuality too. Any non-procreative sex has been deemed shameful, deviant, not allowed.
Not
the
holy.
fundamentalist kind of religious take on orgasm even is the reason orgasm exists is to make us procreate. Like, that's the only reason. But no, we know that this is about well-being, pleasure, intimacy, connection, enjoyment of life. I mean,
Connection to divinity.
connection to divinity, creativity. Like, it's just... So yeah, there's a chapter called Sexual Evolution where I talk about this being kind of the undone work of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution kind of liberated women from having to have babies when they have sex. But the fact that there is still so much kind of weird, unspoken slut shaming, or spoken even, around women who don't have children, or just this kind of side eye of like, oh, I see you. You know, it's the fact that that still exists and that being a woman without kids is still so taboo just tells me there's still work to be done in this area. Not least that homophobia and transphobia is also still so rampant, you know, and that anybody engaging with their sexuality in ways that are seen as deviant are demonized. This is part of our ongoing sexual evolution as a human species, I believe, you know. And if anything, I would, you know, I spoke to evolutionary biologists about this, and I just, from a philosophical standpoint, I can't help but think if organized religion and patriarchal structures had just butted out of the ways that in which people engage with their sexuality, we wouldn't be having these kind of population crises. We might have like just the right amount of people on the planet.
We don't need any more. This is bullshit that there's a crisis.
Right.
We definitely don't need any more.
No. The planet,
AI
the planet
is taking all of our jobs anyway.
Well, that's the other thing. And this is like just, you know, Elon Musk, like I said, is one of the main sort of most vocal and
it's the whole family, right? If I'm not mistaken, the little bit that I know, because his dad is also like a big.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, you got to look into it. It's a family
this
thing, and it's a big like populate the earth. It's a whole thing.
Interesting.
Yeah,
okay,
I don't
need to
know
do more
enough
research on this. I'm mentioning it because he's featured quite prominently in a new documentary called Birth Gap that's really heavy on the scaremongering around population collapse, and very, very clearly in the documentary interviewing multiple women. So why have you left it too late to have children?
No men,
like,
though.
There's all these men sort of scratching their heads going, what happened in the birth rate really started to decline in the 1970s. What happened? I mean, it's just, what happened? I'm like, the women's liberation movement, you guys. What happened? Why is the birth rate declining? And then they interview all these women. Why have you left it so late? Don't you realize you should have been doing this in your 20s? It's just really shocking. Anyway, Musk is featured quite prominently talking about population collapse, whilst at the same time investing billions of dollars, which could be going into, I don't know, things like childcare or healthcare, or, you know, things that people and families actually need, with a mission to essentially colonize Mars, whilst also putting more billions of dollars into self-driving car technologies and other AI technologies, which will essentially eradicate the need for humans for the purpose of maximizing profits for corporations. So it's just, the hypocrisy of it all just makes me want to vomit, honestly.
Well, please keep vomiting and keep talking about it.
Yeah, let's keep talking about it.
Thank you for taking the time. I'm like so in love with this conversation. I really believe as a mother that we have to really honor everyone's individuality.
Right.
No two people are the same. Literally no two people are the same. I'm like so thrilled. Like I get a high off of your happiness, your confidence in your choices. When you sat up there and you were like, and then I'm turning 47 and I'll tell you, I got no regrets. Like that makes me so happy, knowing that we get to choose, that there are many ways. Like, you know, there's a Rolodex of people that we sort of point to on this podcast of all the different ways to be a mother. And also you don't have to be a mother. You just don't, it doesn't have to get done. You can doula other people's beautiful babies in the form of books, in the form of actual babies, in the form of,
businesses, podcasts, relationships,
their own selves.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of work we can do on this earth. I love the work you're doing. And I'm really grateful for the life you're living. Thank you.
Thank you. That's
thank
awesome.
you so much. And thank you for being here. Guys, check out the book. This is just the beginning. This is just like the tip of the iceberg. So enjoy Women Without Kids by Ruby Warrington. Where can we find you?
On Instagram at Ruby Warrington. I have a love-hate relationship with Instagram, but when I have something I actually want to talk about, I appreciate having the platform. So I'm using it currently. I might take a break in the summer. So I'm there. But my website, rubywarrington.com, you mentioned a podcast. There is a Women Without Kids podcast. It's a limited series that I created from research interviews for the book. So really in-depth interviews with social scientists, evolutionary biologists, psychologists about all the kind of issues that we've been discussing. I think that's where I'm at for now.
Great. And you're on your book tour now? You're going to go off to Germany?
Yes, from here I go to London and then Berlin, and then I probably will be doing something in Miami. I've also got a Women Without Kids in-person retreat happening at Kripalu in Massachusetts in the middle of June. So
one of my favorite places on earth.
Fabulous.
What a great venue.
Please come join us.
I literally couldn't be better suited, so I'll see you there.
Okay, great.
Thank you, as always, for listening to the Mom Curious podcast. My name is Danielle Rabbani. I am your host, and I would love to continue this conversation at Daniela Rabbani on Instagram. And if you'd be so kind to rate and review, share this podcast, I would be just really grateful. Catch you next time, every Tuesday on the Mom Curious podcast. Produced by Hoff Studios. You can find them at Hoff Studios on Instagram as well. All right, have a great day.